Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to our early morning session, Food for Thought. My name is Gerhard Wiesheu. I'm the president of Frankfurt Main Finance. I'm very happy that we are able to welcome so many people today in the morning. I think we have participants out of 13 countries. That's great. We are looking forward to listen to a very interesting presentation today. I will introduce to you our speaker, our keynote speaker, in a few minutes to you. I also would like to take the opportunity to thank our long-term trustful cooperation partner. It's the Association of Foreign Banks here in Germany. Thank you so much for your ongoing support. Well, ladies and gentlemen, last week was a very important event for us representing a global financial center, Frankfurt, because the latest calculation was done by a Yen group of the Global Financial Center Index. And we were all looking forward to see the numbers. And we are very happy that we are able to announce that we are now ranked number 9th out of 114 global financial centers. This is a very good result, because to be among the best, or let's say the most attractive global financial centers is a very good achievement. So we all were thinking what will happen after Brexit and who can participate. There are different, articles in the papers, etc. But looking at the index, which is published by Yen Group, I think it is clear that Frankfurt is now in the pole position in continental Europe, not just in Euroland, but in continental Europe. You can see that, well, I have the numbers here. I saw Luxembourg, it's ranked 17th, Paris ranked 25th, Amsterdam 28th, and we are ranked 9th. So this is a good result. Now, the question, of course, is what is the reason behind? This is important for all of us to know where we can work on. We need to analyze the data. We need to know, of course, the numbers of our competitors, because this is a horse race, as you know, it doesn't stop. You have to always brush up and be on your toes in order to really make the competition. Well, for that reason, we see, of course, the top financial centers, New York, London, Shanghai, Hong Kong, etc. It's very, very close at the top, also among the top 10, of course, and therefore it is important to see where our strengths are and where we can even brush up our capabilities and make Frankfurt even more attractive. And who could be better fit, or I think we have today the best person to help us to have a look at this financial centers, the data, etc., of the indices which were published. And we have today a very prominent keynote speaker, Professor Mainelli. He is executive chairman of Yen Group, and he will speak about today measuring up financial centers, the latest from Yen Indices. Well, let me just briefly introduce Professor Mainelli, because I think he's really an expert and has a lot of achievements. It would be even better to tell you what he has not achieved, because he has so many achievements. It would be, I think, shorten the introduction time. But let me just give you a few background information on him. Professor Mainelli is qualified accountant, securities professional, computer specialist, and management consultant. Educated at Harvard University and Trinity College in Dublin. He gained his PhD at the London School of Economics, where he has also a visiting professor of innovation and IT. Professor Mainelli co-founded Yen Group, the City of London's leading think tank, promoting societal advance through better finance and technology. ZN Group is renowned for its global financial, green finance, and smart centers indices. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think I won't use too much time here because we're all looking forward to the presentation of Professor Mainelli. Now, just one housekeeping thing. If you have questions, please input that in to the Q&A section of Zoom. If you want to share any comments on the session, we would highly appreciate if you could use the name tag at Frankfurt Main Finance Digital and hashtag virtual food for thought. The presentation will be sent to you after the presentation, so you can have a look after that presentation. Well, Professor Mainelli, we are set now. The floor is yours. Please take over. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Gerhard, for that generous introduction. And thank you, Hubertus, Andreas, Sophie, and the team at Frankfurt Main Finance for hosting today. Gerhard, just to check that the screen is showing.
Very good.
Great.
Very good, yeah.
Want to be sure. Well, welcome everyone and good morning. I'm delighted to be here at Food for Thought. And what I'm here to talk about today is very much the indices that ZN are producing. We produce 3 indices of our own, and we also produce indices for other organizations, law firms, trade bodies, etc. But the 3 indices we're here to talk about today are the Global Financial Centers Index, the Global Green Finance Index, and the Smart Centers Index. And they feature really because we have, as a think tank, been running a program for 16 years called Long Finance. This predates the financial crisis. What we were trying to look at is, when would we know our financial system is working? And I believe that is in many ways a deeper question than people give it credit. We divide that into a variety of areas, looking at meta-commerce on the right, the economics of things, eternal coin monetary policy. Distributed futures covers the role of technology. Sustainable futures is obviously about green issues and ESG. And financial center futures, I think, will be the focus of much of this presentation. Now, the factor assessment indices that we began back in 2003. And I want to call your mind back just a few years earlier. If you go back to 1999, some 22 years ago, there were predictions that the City of London was doomed because it had not entered the euro. And the City of London Corporation, where I happen to be an alderman and I'm sheriff for these 2 years during the pandemic, was interested in seeing what the impact of being outside of the euro might have on the City of London's financial services industry. The study that was done was called Sizing Up the City, and it was published in 2002. And the difficulty that I had with that study is that it looked at all of the major centers that the City of London was up against. So it looked very clearly at New York, without question, Paris, Frankfurt, you would assume, and that was it. There was no Hong Kong, there was no Tokyo, there was nothing. And even by 2003, it was, I think, fairly evident to anybody who'd been on an aircraft that this was not the world as we knew it. On the other hand, those traditional studies were done by sending a few consultants on a nice credit card to places to interview people and kind of write it up. There was very little statistics behind it. And there was certainly no way that the City of London could afford the initial 46 centers that I suggested needed to be assessed. So we came up with the idea of creating an index, which had, of course, the advantage of more comparability, longitudinal analysis, as you would call it. But we were faced with a difficulty, which was, how did you take ratings and base them? And our principal distinction between what we did and other indices is the participants in our index, through the statistical methods, effectively produce the ratings for the instrumental factors. So we take, and in this edition, 140 instrumental factors. These are published statistics on all sorts of subjects and classifications on all sorts of parameters. For example, common law or civil law. We put in things like murder rates, which many people don't think matters, but correlate interestingly because, strangely, people don't bring their money to locations where they get killed. But the bulk of it is there are things to do with financial centers, and I'll come on to that in a moment. We then combine that with a global survey, and that survey over the years has grown and now includes us surveying over 10,000 people every year who work in finance. The center is therefore global, the index is therefore global, and it does tend to look at the international positioning of centers. So you could have a very large, somewhat isolated domestic economy, and you wouldn't do particularly well in here. It's very much on the international end of things. And it's also typically taking individuals' perceptions into account, and therefore, if they tend to be looking ahead into the future. And so it does really correlate reasonably well with future performance. There are 114 centers in GFCI 29, so it has grown since those 46 some 15, 16 years ago. We began the study, as I said, in 2003. We began running it properly in 2005, but we only published from 2007, March 2007. That's because we really wanted to get the index under control. But it has consistently grown. And you might find that somewhat surprising, but the rise of Asia has been driving a tremendous amount of this. In addition, though, policymakers faced with trying to develop sort of the economic development of a region or a city do find that growing in finance is easy, at least as far as their work is concerned, because it's largely a matter, once you've got basic infrastructure in place, basic infrastructure including things like IT and connectivity, et cetera, it's largely a policy-driven issue. So we're looking now at the moment at another 12 centers that might come into the index if they get sufficient rating by their peers around the world. We also looking at the respondents. The respondents are across a whole variety of sectors. I said there's 10,774, I think, technically in the last edition. You'll note the heavy preponderance, 2/3 of it from Asia Pacific, but then what we're seeing, of course, is that Asia Pacific is rising in both numbers and also in importance. And even in the first edition, we featured Shanghai and Tokyo, Hong Kong and Singapore. So these were already important centers then, just largely unrecognized in the West. You know, it's always important to remember the scale of what we're talking about, which is, you know, getting on for well over 2.5 billion people just in India and China alone. So, as Gerhard reminded us, Frankfurt has risen quite noticeably in the index, particularly amongst the top 10. It rose 12 rating points, which is on a 1,000-point scale that we rate the cities, but that resulted in a rise of 7 points in terms of rank. You might also note, as you look up this index, New York has held on to the top spot, which it took on approximately 6 editions ago. London has fallen fairly materially, actually. We would normally say in our index, you can bounce around by about 20 to 25 points, and on a 1,000-point scale, that's a sort of natural variability we've seen over time. But the fall of London is approaching statistical significance. You'll note as well that London comes in with a rating of 743. It's got Shanghai behind it at 742, Hong Kong at 741, Singapore at 740. So you know, a mere 4-point fall would put London down some 4 positions. So it's an interesting time to be looking at this index, and it's interesting as well to welcome Frankfurt to the ranks of the top 10. I'd like to cover a few items here. Look at some of the detail behind this. All of this is published online, so if you find this too fast, you can read the publication. All the graphs and charts are there. And as per the introduction, the slides will be shared with everyone. And there's quite a wealth of information that we provide online, including interactive tools. So you're welcome to go and use all of that. So let's have a look at a few of the things below it. Well, the first thing has been that over the years of this index, the rise of China has driven the rise of Asia Pacific in general, but don't ignore the rise of, for example, Korea or Vietnam or some of the other centers that are out there. It's important to remember too that prevailing theory in the growth of a financial center prior to the publication of the index was that you had a great economic hinterland, a great economic engine on which you sat a financial center So it was presumed that's why London had grown. It's presumed that's why New York had grown. And back in the early 90s, the contention was that Tokyo would be the dominant financial center in the world. Tokyo is certainly important, but it is not the dominant center. What really matters, as we're beginning to determine in these indices, is connectivity, as well as the domestic hinterland, as well as being open to foreigners. And I'll come on to some of those points in a moment when I close. Over time, the five centers have really fought neck and neck. Shanghai rose from being below at the very beginning. You can see that's purple line on the left, to really contending. And I showed you how tight the spread is at the moment amongst the five of them. And we anticipate that this will keep going given the many developments that we have all seen in the top five centers. Over time, the ranks have become tight. I mentioned earlier that New York had pipped in GFCI 24. London seems to be holding on to that. It had done that before, back in GFCI 15, 16, and 17. And in fact, it was dead equal with London in GFCI 7. I have seen many deals done in London, or for that matter, Singapore or Hong Kong, which had no domestic component whatsoever. Whereas I've never seen that happen in New York or Beijing. The financial deals that are done there have almost always got some reason. I'm taking over a US company, or I'm investing in China. That London is doing well again, but Frankfurt then really shoots up to second place there. Please don't ignore, within the EU, it's one thing, but Zurich and Geneva also, I think, bring into relief the point I made earlier about having no domestic deal making necessary in some of the transactions. Both the United States and Canada have no single dominant center when you get in there domestically. But when you look internationally, things change quite a bit. New York, of course, being the international focus for the United States. Oddly, we've always been a little surprised at the relative performance of Vancouver over Toronto, and Toronto constantly feels that we are in some way anti-Toronto. But this is what the respondents are saying, and I think this reflects the fact that the respondents are looking at Canada from abroad, and the preponderant weight of Asian money in Vancouver, I believe, explains a fair chunk of this difference. We go to the Middle East and Africa. There have been extreme efforts in many of the Middle Eastern centers to establish a financial center. You need only think about Abu Dhabi or the DIFC in Dubai. So there's been a tremendous amount of marketing. Some of this has been quite innovative and I don't think appreciated by us in the West. For example, the focus in the Middle East, also in places like Nur Sultan or Singapore, on arbitration, mediation, and determination. So really getting into the alternative dispute resolution area and setting up effectively zones largely in competition with London, but having set these up some 10 or 15 years ago. Latin America and the Caribbean, always a bit of a problem area, always one where scandal and money laundering seem to constantly bring the ratings down. And the top center, the British Virgin Islands, which did tremendously well, nevertheless only comes in at 58th. And so despite the various offshore elements that are clearly there, not really performing very well as a region. Eastern Europe and Central Asia have been problem children for us in terms of analysis. In fact, it was in this area. Right. So just on the areas of competitiveness and the actual taxonomy itself, there are 140 factors, as I mentioned, across a wide variety of areas. We treat each factor individually, but I would encourage you to go into the book if you'd like to explore them. We have links to every single one of them, as you'd expect, so that you can find them. Now, in terms of areas of competitiveness, we might want to have a little look here at what we call the sub-indices. This is where we take each one of those groups of factors and try and rate it. One of the things that's been intriguing to us over the years is what we call kind of the Anna Karenina principle, that if you remember Tolstoy, all good families are alike, but all unhappy families are unique. And we believe that as you rise up the ranks, fairly obviously, you have to get better and better across the board. Being a specialist doesn't work as well. And what we've certainly seen here is that Frankfurt has been growing rapidly across almost every single area, except, as you'll notice down here, it has been growing in reputation as well, but reputation is probably the place to focus at the moment. And so I'm pleased that folks like Frankfurt Main Finance are really getting the message out there so that we do get a much more fair rating on Frankfurt. When we look at industry subsectors, it's slightly different. Surprisingly for us, banking is not seen by people abroad to be as strong as, for example, investment management or insurance or even trading. And I believe that might be an underrepresentation of what people feel. Equally, areas to work on might be the perception of the government and regulatory situation, particularly with regard to openness and ease of access and setting up businesses. And finally, Fintech, which I'll touch on in a moment, where centers, for example, like Berlin, are seen to be more active. Over time, we've seen genuine improvements in Frankfurt. Most importantly, I think you can see on the areas of competitiveness ranking here, this spider diagram, I should probably explain, works in a slightly different way than you might be used to. In other words, as you come closer to the core, you're doing better. So Frankfurt has improved massively in GSCI, as you can see there, as it moves from pink to red up there from 20th to 9th. Reputation hasn't really budged very much, but the business environment and the financial sector development have clearly improved. When we look at industry sectors, again, you can see that banking, for some reason, isn't seen abroad as strong as I would personally see it, but investment management and insurance have improved quite noticeably indeed. I wouldn't stick simply to one single index, and we do, as I mentioned, have the other two indices. I won't go through them at all as I did the GFCI, but the Global Green Finance Index shows that Frankfurt is not rating very well. Green has traditionally been almost a Western European affectation, and I, as a fairly committed environmentalist, it's not something that I would like to see, but it is certainly how it is seen by people abroad. And we are noticing enormous moves in China, in Singapore, in Africa even, as people are really beginning to market their financial centers on green. One of the interesting players in this space has particularly been Guernsey in the Channel Islands, where people are making just absolutely enormous efforts. We believe this could be quite a distinguishing factor in an area that Frankfurt might want to consider a little bit more seriously. When you look here in the Global Green Finance Index, we're able to contrast really depth and quality. Depth is largely how well does a center walk the talk in terms of green. When I go there, do people talk to me about green products? They talk to me about my carbon dependence, et cetera. Quality is very much how well do I do in terms of the advice that I get. So people believe that they get good advice in Frankfurt, but that compared with other centers, emotionally almost, there isn't quite the commitment to green issues. The Smart Centers Index is also an index. It's not a fintech index. It's an index really directed at people wanting to understand the innovation cluster. And again, here Frankfurt has a ways to go. Not particularly bad out of 100 centers, but not seen as quite the innovation centers that you would normally expect, based typically around universities. There are a number of regulatory approaches to that that we could take, but we'll go into that as we go to Q&A. So I'd just like to pick up on 4 trends. The first trend is obviously COVID, what's happening. It's pretty clear that we're going to be seeing some major changes in the financial services sector. In particular, the swing to home working, which has hitherto been seen to be something that Western Europeans were talking about, we've seen in this index more interest in Asia in moving to home working. So I'm not 100% sure this idea that Europe is in some ways going to be affected more than Asia, true. Second thing is we're seeing a drop in business travel. A statistic I like to point out is that in 2019, a boom year, business travel in Scandinavia dropped by 8%, perhaps due to Flygsskam, flight shaming. Do remember that when we had the volcano in 2010, travel in Scandinavia only dropped 4%. So this is an 8% drop in business travel simply due to social mores changing. Another thing we're seeing is that we may not be in the future having an index or three indices so completely separate. We have a Fintech section in our Global Financial Centers Index, but it seems to be merging more and more to almost equate to our Smart Centers Index. A lot of people talk about tech fin or whatever, but I believe that this combination of finance and technology, and these are the two industries that are most susceptible to working from home, are creating knowledge clusters. I've said, for example, that here in London, we've had a torrid COVID-19 year if you look at the geographical city of London. However, if you look at the southeast of England, technical and financial cluster, we've actually had a boom year. And so I'm curious, and my team are curious, and you can see that we're doing numbers to see if we can get behind this. We're very interested in whether or not the future of geographic centers, is really dependent on their commuter intensity, and whether or not some of these centers that I've highlighted here, Hong Kong, New York, San Francisco, London, which have that type of commuter intensity, might be the ones that change the most and might wind up somewhat of a hollowed city core more devoted to residential, whilst the workers are now working more from home. Looking from a London perspective, my pitch to the City of London has been to really get together with picking up a larger market share of a shrinking market, and that is those physically based international deals that we spoke about, really going back to the old business coffee house that we used to be. So I'll pause there, if I may. I'm having a few Zoom problems. I'm not quite sure why, but here we go. And
yeah, thanks, Michael. Thanks a lot. It was very insightful, and not to worry, the Zoom problems, despite that one little breakdown for a minute or two, were within limits, which we're getting used to these days. We have the first few questions, and ladies and gentlemen, don't hesitate to come up with more. The first question is rather technical, Michael. It's about how do you weight factors? Are they equally weighted? Are you adjust weightings? How do you balance the various factors which you take into account?
That's a good question, Hubertus. And by the way, you might have another go at the video. It might work now. The screen sharing's off. Yes, well, the factor weightings are produced using a technique called support vectors. So if you want to get into the statistics, there's a lot of detail in the methodology on the website, but to answer it in brief, the entire approach was to try and figure out if an individual, say Hubertus rates 8 centers, in fact the average person rates 9, can we guess what Hubertus would rate centers that he hadn't participated in? And we do that sort of saying, well, here's the sensitivity of Hubertus to these particular factors. It is a bit of a scary system. It's very akin to the machine learning systems used by Amazon or anybody else to recommend something to you. In fact, I've participated in it myself, and it's sort of terrifying because the machine guesses what I would rate centers as. So I'll give it sort of 10 centers that I know, and I then write down on a sheet of paper another 5 or 6 centers that I know, and the center will guess how I would have rated them, typically within 1 point. It is a bit scary, and that's because different people take into account different things. You might be at an age in life where you're working in a center and you're quite concerned with access. You might be more concerned with schools. You might be more concerned with the nightlife. There's an amazing variety of things that make a financial center a financial center. And so we take all of these individual perceptions, create effectively an automated individual for each one of those, rate all of the centers, and then average them. So there is no weighting by Zien. The weighting is produced by each individual who answers the questions.
That's interesting. That's very interesting. So it's obviously dynamic, I suppose. And the next question is also about one of your index elements. It comes from Frederick Delamin. The connectivity and proximity are important factors. So how do you sense that places like Sydney or Vancouver, which are obviously are not that close to economic centers, do fare so well?
Yeah. Well, one of the things in the index is we pay quite a bit of attention to connectivity. In fact, we have a diagram we call the hair dryer diagram, because it looks like a whole bunch of hair flustered out from a center and showing its connections to various others. The first thing is, as you'll know in finance, air travel has an out proportion weighting to proximity, and therefore a lot of the proximity issues are foreshortened because senior individuals are flying to places, and so the difference between a 1 hour flight and a 2 hour flight is pretty minimal. So that's one thing I would point out. The second thing is that some of the far-flung places, particularly in Australia, nevertheless represent some decent-sized economic hinterlands. So Australia and its strength in commodities is a good example, mean that people will be going to Sydney and to Melbourne. Interestingly, not to Perth. We thought Perth would be rising when we first started this index 10 years ago, but definitely continues to come to Sydney and Melbourne. And so distance has hitherto not been a particularly big issue. I'm beginning to wonder if we're going to see a rich element of distance. I think it was Francis Cairncross at The Economist, who about 20 years ago spoke about the death of distance. And here I am 20 years later saying, possibly due to COVID and video conferencing, we will be seeing the death of distance. And this again might play into my point earlier that we could be looking much more at regions being places than some type of core geographic center. So, will Australia, for example, become stronger whilst Melbourne and Sydney are largely irrelevant to the financial industry?
So clearly connectivity, when it comes to net connectivity, to internet connectivity, is what we see in Frankfurt to be one of the key competitive areas. And so that certainly becomes at least a key element of the new proximity. Now, Pierre,
there's an interesting point there, Hubert. Is the RAND Corporation came out with this idea of data gravity, pointing out that you can't just place your server farms, in the middle of a desert somewhere that's too far away, because you lose the app connectivity. And a lot of the machine learning algorithms require vast quantities of data almost instantaneously. So we're seeing the positioning of data centers, for example, closer to urban conurbations, because there's a trade-off between efficiency, which is given by distance and cheap electricity, and proximity, which allows you to do some impressive processing.
Yeah, and we see here in Frankfurt in the east, we do have the huge server farms, which, by the way, consume about 50% of the entire energy consumption of the city, just to cool them down. Whereas we do have in the west the stock market, and along that main pipes is where we all have the heavy traders. So it certainly is a key element in infrastructure today. So Michael, Pierre has an interesting question. He says there is a closing in on the top financial centers. They are converging in terms of index numbers. He refers to Europe, but I also think we can sense that for the whole world. So he says it does seem that to be number 1, 2, or 3 isn't so unique anymore. Do you have any competition of that? Is that the time of change of guards where we narrow and we'll see a more clear distinction in the future, or are we more or less now in an extremely competitive, tied up world? What's your view on that?
Well, I think that's a really shrewd observation. And it's very shrewd because there's two things that have always bothered me about our index. One is our index does create quite clearly competition. You know, I've got a few points on you, you've got a few points on me. But is there a case that maybe you could be fully mature? What happens if you're fully mature? And perhaps this handful of centers now at the top are reaching what I might call close maturity. The second thing is the lack of recognition of how financial centers work, particularly the global ones, and they work by cooperating. Society has a huge number of ways of solving problems: command and control, taxation, regulation. Markets are only one of them. And we in financial markets have an obligation to show that markets work. So if you take something like climate change and carbon, which came out of Kyoto in 1997, that was our ultimate dream. The world has decided to use markets, traded markets, to solve this absolutely enormous problem. And we're all in it together. So there's no particular reason that my being a slightly better carbon center than yours is the place to focus. The place to focus is on society, saying to society, we're doing a good job reducing carbon. You know, these emissions trading schemes do work. We're all in it together. And if I'm doing well here in Europe and you're doing well there in China, that's a good thing, society. You don't need to take other mechanisms. We have a lot to cooperate on as much as we do to compete.
Very interesting. And I couldn't agree more with you, Michael, on that one. The next question comes from Christine. Post-Brexit, several cities are challenging. London and, of course, Frankfurt with that as well. The Dublin, Paris, Amsterdam. Do you have some early observation? Which are the areas where they're doing particularly well? What should Frankfurt watch out for and keep on its toes?
Well, my office is right by the Bank of England, and June 2016, the day after the vote, I ran into representatives of financial centers in London already out touting for business, almost 5 years ago. What we've seen has, I think, been people recognizing their strengths and their weaknesses. And many people miss some of them. So, for example, a large group of family offices moved to Milan. Milan offered special breaks there. There were some back office moves to Madrid. Dublin opened up for business, touted for it, put down a fairly high quality standard. And there was an often unremarked speech by the Minister for Finance, Michael Darcy, about 3 years ago, where he said, we're kind of full. And Dublin stopped really trying to go very aggressively. They wanted about 10,000 jobs, and they got them. I think Luxembourg is a very exciting and interesting area, particularly when you get into fund management. But we could talk about the geography of Luxembourg for hours, and I think that there are limitations there. Paris is interesting because it used to be the traditional home. If you watched all the American films in the 50s, Paris was the center of Europe and Paris was the center of finance. But as many of you know, there's only been one major move to Paris post-Brexit. And I think a lot of that has to do with French employment law. I recall somebody saying to me not recently that, after the last financial crisis, they were able to shut down their offices where they needed to. This is back in 2010. And then they started reopening them 3 years ago. They're still in litigation, shutting down the employment in their Paris office. And whatever you say and whatever brochures you look at, whatever Eiffel Tower light up ceremony you're looking at, people in financial services share those tales. And they know that you really don't want to get bound up in French employment law. So, going ahead, as I said earlier, my big question is why amongst our participants, I hasten to say, there isn't quite the recognition of the strength of Frankfurt in banking. And I think, sadly, regulation will probably mean that Frankfurt has a major role going forward, almost no matter what it does. But I believe that Amsterdam has probably a role in fintech, Luxembourg definitely in fund management. I think Dublin is probably capped out. And this might be the stable nature of Europe for perhaps the next decade.
Yeah. It's very interesting that you flagged labor law, Michael, because that was particularly what we've been told in Frankfurt ahead of the referendum. When I recall those days, I was called nuts to actually prepare for it, but we did. We felt it was a real option, and as we know from working in finance, real options have value. So we prepared, and I discussed it with a number of the big US banks, and they told me labor law was a key issue for that. And against that background of what you just mentioned about Paris, that explains it even more, because what we addressed then, whereas everybody else was looking into perks, into tax advantages, like you pointed out, Milano have extremely attractive tax setup. We focused on labor law, and we got it in the Brexit readiness law, and that exactly the situation is cannot happen, and it seems to have worked out. So sometimes these small things that appear to be small have a major impact at the end of the day. But you mentioned regulation before, and if I look at your cobweb, which you presented, regulation was the one area where actually Frankfurt got worse. What happened? Where in which data did you find that regulation went south in Germany? What happened here?
Well, I'd have to dig into our specific numbers on that, Hubertus. I haven't really prepared for that question. However, I think what we're probably also seeing is encountering regulation. So Christine's question, particularly good one, but we're at an early stage. A lot of people effectively pressed their Brexit buttons only a few months ago. So they had set up, they were ready to do it, but they really didn't believe that it would be quite as chaotic as it has been. I mean, basically, there's no agreement. And so they found themselves, particularly during 2019 and 2020, pressing those buttons. And that's when they really began to encounter the regulation. And the regulation is materially different. As somebody who's been around the block, I remember desperately trying for a French bank at one time to get their chart of accounts into any kind of sensible shape, but for the type of business that they did. But the regulatory environment specifies your chart of accounts. You have no choice, and that's not the way that it works under, in the UK or in the United States. And so you begin to see some of these problems, but you only begin to see them when you're doing them. And so I believe that people are finally coming up against the reality of what has been talked about in the United Kingdom, that the regulatory system here is fairly, I shouldn't say easy. Andrew Bailey, the governor of the bank, gave a speech last month saying there's no intention, and I believe him, no intention of easing the regulation, but the way that the regulation is applied is better. And I believe that's an area that Europe could work on. I mean, the biggest thing that you find as you go around the world, everybody says, well, it's a lot of numbers, it's a lot of confusion, it's a lot of this and that. Come on, just tell us, give us one thing that we should do. And the one thing I always say is treat all comers fairly. And when you see laws that are biased, whether they're in Korea or China or Europe or the UK, biased against outsiders, that's an area that will not grow, because financial services has to be treated on an equal basis, native, domestic against international and foreign.
That's very interesting that you say that, Michael, because that has been pretty much how we marketed Frankfurt. I said, well, the big thing here is you're going to be treated equally wherever you come from any place in the world. That's what what makes Frankfurt go. And interestingly enough, you flagged that point. But let me get back to that regulatory issue. I figure that indeed, and when I'm speaking to Brexit banks that relocated, it is reporting in regulation. It's the rather incoherent definition of certain aspects that needs to be reported. So there's an additional number of reports which you give to the ECB, to the European Banking Authority, to ESMA, and so forth. So each and every of these institutions does have their specifics and their specific definitions of same terms and special reporting requirements. Do you see that this is a specific German, or do you rather see that to be a specific European issue?
Yes, I think it's a European and a US issue. And I think a lot of it has to do with the over-legalization. We're trying to combine a system, markets, which exists in a world of probabilities, with a legal and consumer protection structure where there is black and white, right and wrong. And so one is effectively a system of presumed logic. If then you are guilty and here is your fine, versus a business approach, which is a much more nuanced one. I think this is a wider issue, and I in fact refer frequently to a German author, Ulrich Beck, and his rather prescient book in the 80s called The Risk Society, where he pointed out that one of the problems we have in society is we're constantly de-risking, and that there's a tremendous bias towards the health and safety cultures that we frequently see, where it doesn't matter, stuff doesn't happen, somebody must be behind it, somebody must be wrong, somebody must be at fault. And then we have a regulatory structure of, as you point out, great complexity, where despite all of these reportings, take Wirecard, nobody's responsible and nobody's at fault. And so we have the business people, basically risking things on the line against a bunch of regulators who don't seem to be responsible for the system that they're responsible for. So I think these things are going to have to change. I think it's going to be very, very interesting, because it is a competitive world, to see how the Chinese respond to similar issues. An engineering nation that is becoming more legalistic. So will it go our way, or will it find some new path? As you can tell, I believe we've gone a little bit too far, only a little bit too far on the regulatory side. We're not treating people like adults, and we don't really look at the core of the system. I said Long Finance is interested in some of this, but some of the moves towards central bank digital currencies, for example, might at a swath remove many of the dangers in banking if they go up one route. We might find that, for example, fractional reserve banking isn't the way of the future, and that would remove one enormous source of leverage and problems from the system. So there could be some pretty tremendous changes ahead. I'm not advocating them or against them. We're merely exploring them.
Another interesting observation of yours, Michael, was on green finance. And you rightly highlighted that that is an area of improvement. It puzzled me a bit to see Munich and Hamburg ahead of it. I was wondering how that could happen in a market which I found throughout Germany to be rather homogeneous. How come there is a differentiation that's been so huge between the German financial centers?
Yeah, this is where, so GGFI is in the 7th edition will be coming out next month. So it's a young index, and young indices do tend to bounce around a little bit. But we began the index really because the MAVA Foundation, the Swiss foundation behind WWF, and I think the family foundation, decided that finance really needed to grow up and treat green seriously. But one of the difficulties in the green and the green index has been it's very, very susceptible to marketing. And I think marketing is a big issue in that one. We're working very hard to incorporate harder green instrumental factors. And we're hoping, particularly with the Chinese having begun their ETS, their emissions trading scheme, at the beginning of last month, that we're going to see a little bit more materiality in green. The green index has been dominated by the issuance of green bonds. And there are many, many other areas of green finance, but green bonds dominate people's perceptions. You talk to them about green finance, like, oh yes, a green bond. You're kind of like, well, what about some of the other stuff? Well, yes, but there's green bonds, and it's become the mantra of where is the issuance of the bonds coming from.
Yeah, can you give us a sense on when you look at the taxonomy, if you look at all those European programs, will they actually have a major impact? Will they be a unifier when it comes to green financial centers, or will they still be an opportunity for differentiation?
Just when you say those programs, Hubertus, what were you referring to?
The EU program on green and sustainable finance.
Oh, right. Sorry, got you. So, yes, that one. I think there's some real dangers there at the moment, in my opinion. And this is somebody who's been in the environment for ages, and I probably ought to point out that I kind of wear on my sleeve, at least when we're talking about climate change, the importance of the carbon markets. I helped, if we go back to 1997, we in the City of London wrote a paper in January, which we published in January 1999, on trading carbon and what it could mean for the City of London. And we ran the shadow trading here in London up until 2003, when the EU realized, oh my gosh, we promised we'd launch a market in 2005. And we were able to produce for them in a box, really. We'd met once a month. We had worked out what our energy costs were. We had decided, we'd written the contracts under English law. We had treated this very, very seriously. So we were quite committed to it. It was an enormous disappointment that the governments of Europe decided to issue far too many permits. And if they can't do that, you can't work out that if you want to emit 1 million tons, you issue 1 million permits. How are you going to deal with taxation and anything else? So very, very disappointed there. But the reason I go through that is, at the moment, there's a heavy emphasis on ESG. And we now have a plethora of taxonomies. I think last year the economists called it an alphabet soup of various ESG taxonomies. Many of them done by the boys and the girls, by which I mean the law firms or the accountancy firms, who are not really known for their scientific knowledge of climate change. And it does seem like a huge job for the boys and girls rating these bonds and doing all of that. I'm far more excited about a movement I had a hand in doing, which largely came out of France, which has been these policy performance bonds. They're also called performance incentive bonds, or sustainability linked bonds, or obligation d'environnement. And one of the things about those is these are basically saying, throw the taxonomy and the ESG out, and the interest rate on my bond will go up if I fail to meet my targets. And if I meet my targets, it goes down. As simple as that. I wrote a booklet in French in 2017 at the request, I hasten to add, of the French government and the Prime Minister's think tank. And that led to Danone and Louis Vuitton issuing them, and Enel has issued them. And this has been a genuine continental movement, which is bypassing in many ways the EU's program, which is directed at the theory that increasing the cost of capital will change behavior. I'm sorry, in my youth, when I had my long hair and sandals in the 70s, I was out protesting against apartheid. But I don't think apartheid ended because we got our universities to divest. I think apartheid ended for other reasons. And I believe the same thing in the green market. What we really need to do is have a hard and fairly significant price for carbon, and that will change corporate behavior far more rapidly than the finance director saying, I can go out and pay a lot of money to one of the big four accountants and call it a green bond, and then get an interest rate that pays for their fees. Or I can go out and issue a normal bond for about the same rate. Which one do I do? I believe ESG has a limited lifetime.
That's an interesting discussion, Michael, and certainly one which will take us much longer, and will have us in the next couple of years exchange views on that. So it's 1 month to go for your Green Finance Index?
That's correct, Hubertus.
So we're very much looking forward to that, learn more about it, because that's certainly a position we are not comfortable with, I may say. We'll have to work on that one. And once again, thank you very much for your numerous inputs, for your hints on where we have to work on. We've got our work cut out in Frankfurt now. And thanks very much for giving us and sharing us with these insights. Last time when you presented your results, you had Shenzhen as a guest with a Great Bay Area project. They will follow you in one of our next opportunities. They will become our guests. So dear guests and dear visitors, watch out for that. It's on April 22nd, where we have Dr. King Au, the Executive Director of the Financial Services Development Council of Hong Kong, talking about the Greater Bay Area and how that is going to change the financial landscape. Again, lots of opportunities. Michael, thanks once more. Thanks for getting up so early in London. It was very good having you this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Hubertus, and apologies for the channel connection.
No worries. Bye, everybody, and have a successful day.